web design students out there. We're going to do a series of some videos about the grid. If we're going to do layouts, you can use the flex box, which we did for our nav bar and our buttons and things. But if you want ultimate control over the layout of your elements on a website, you really got to know the grid. So I'm going to start with this complete guide to grid. This is going to be your textbook for here. We're going to hit some concepts in this first video, just kind of covering an overview for those that don't like to read and prefer to hear it. Then I'm going to give some demos. And then once we do the demos, then I'm going to give you an assignment where your job will be to replicate the grid layout of some other layout. You're going to get an image and your job is to lay it out. And then your final job is for your final website, your home page. I'd like you to design it one way and design another for all your individual pages so that there are a couple different layouts on your final project. And that's how we're going to end out the school year. And how we divide this up, and we'll just see what we can get to. All right, without any more talk, let's just do it. The grid is how you can lay out items. So we're just going to kind of scroll down. It's 2 dimensions. It's your grid, right? And so here we go. Let's just talk about some of the basics of it. It's been around for a while. You'll see words and description on some of these items, like whether it's prefixed or unprefixed. So the Chrome browser, Firefox, Safari, and Opera, as of March 2017, this has been supported on these browsers. And then the syntax for Internet Explorer 10 and 11 at that time was a little outdated. One of the things you want to do is go to caniuse.com if you ever want to, caniuse.com, and figure it out. So let's do grid. Oh, CSS Grid. Here, let's go back right there. So what you can do is you can see, and the one you're looking for is IE and Edge. And look, IE 11 has partial support. So one of the things you're going to have to do is look to see what they do. Now it says with prefix MS for Microsoft. And so what you can do is you can just click and see. If you ever see a dash MS dash, they're saying we want IE 11 to do this. Okay, so the Edge, however, should have it supported. So yeah, Edge, as of version 16, it's been fully supported normally. If it's green, that means you don't need the vendor prefixes. And so there's a browser called Baidu. So whatever. Okay, so you can take a look at it. You can look at known issues. So Edge 18 and below has problems supporting the calc within. So you can just find out what you need to know. The best thing to do is to test out your design on a lot of different sites. For the sake of our class, we're just web design 1 and 2, and so we're not going to worry too much about this. But if you are doing a senior project and you're in one of my classes, then I recommend you test on a variety of browsers just to make sure things work, or at the very least, go to the site and check it out. All right, moving along. We're just going to assume everything on here works. Oh, and there's the list. IE 11, notice that was orange, but Edge is fine. I just went over that. All right, definitely we need to go over terms. In order to do this, it really helps. We have a grid container. This works just like the flex box. We have one item that holds other items. So if you're going to do a layout, you need an element that is your container. You can give it a class of container. It makes it a lot easier. And then the nice thing about that is if you have it, or you could call it grid container, and then that will become your grid container. And then you can add other classes to change up what that grid looks like. It's really handy. And you'll find it's very similar to Flex, where you have a container and then you have items that are inside of the grid. So on the left is things you apply to generate the entire grid. Stuff on the right is for individual items. So notice we have this div class equals item, item 1, item, item 2, item, item 3. And just as a recap, in case you were wondering what's going on, why 2 classes, let me give you 2 things. 1, when you have more than one class, you need to separate it with a space. Number 2, each of these items are allowing us to see, and you can target something where all your items have a certain thing applied. Now, these are the children of the containers, different ways to get there. This class is probably indicating where it fits in the grid. That's all you really need to know. And of course, the idea here is you're putting your content inside of these items in your grid. So for example, you have this div with the class of container, and one of the items has a paragraph inside. That would be something that's inside of the grid. So you're going to be placing stuff in it. This should be obvious, but I want to make sure you hear that. So you also have grid lines. You may or may not ever see these, right? But they are what split up your grid. And so the idea here is a line is what's forming what makes up the grid. So this is kind of like a table, but it's not. And it's 2 rows, 3 columns. And of course, when you create your grid lines create the grid, but you can combine multiple cells. So inside of each individual grid line is a cell. And you can combine them, and you can do a lot of stuff with it. So we call that a single unit of the grid. All right, so keep that in mind. We have a grid track, which would be the space between 2 adjacent grid lines. Think of them like columns or rows of the grid. So a grid track, you could be referring to this row, which is yellow, or you could be referring to a column, which would be up and down. So grid track. Grid area is just what space is surrounded by 4 grid lines, one on top, one on the right, one on the bottom, one on the left. That's a grid area. It could be any number of grid cells. It could be 1, it could be a bunch of them. Here's the grid area between row grid lines 1 and 3 and column grid. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3. We start counting with 1. From top to bottom, there are 3 grid lines. From left to right, there are 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, keep that in mind. Grid area. All right, we have some grid properties, and we have properties for the parent and properties for the children. Again, you need to set it through display grid. You also have what's called an inline grid, which will treat it like it's an inline level. This would be good if you want to create. Now, you could use this with Flexbox as well, but an inline grid could be like, let's say you're going to have a button and a search widget and something else or whatever, and they're all just going to be lined up. You might do it using an inline grid. There's a lot of info on here that I don't really have time to go into. So one of the things I want you to kind of think about, and by the way, we're going to start on the left-hand side and work our way down, just give you a general idea, and then we'll talk about the right-hand side. You're going to need to do a deep dive, and I can give you kind of the benefit. I'll show you what I like to do with the grid as well and not get into all the details, but it's helpful to understand these terms because you're going to see them. So you can also set columns and rows. That's really handy. So you can define them. So you've got columns, rows with a space-separated list of values. They will represent what's called the track size, and the space between them is the space between them represents the grid line. So we have track size can be a length, a percentage, a fraction of the free space in the grid using the FR unit. This is new. We've never gone over this sizing. So FR stands for fraction of the free space. So each one, it's sort of like, well, let's take a look at an example of where we have fractions. So you might say 1 FR, 1 FR, and then you might have this, we'll look at that a little bit later. It's really cool. You can do things like repeat 5 different single fractions. So that'd be like 5 columns, for example. And, like this would be what, if you do 2 FRs, 1 FR, 1 FR, then that's 2 equal sized width of columns. So if you wanted to just have a 2-column layout, that's it, just 2 columns, and you want each of them 50%, you would do 1 FR, 1 FR, they would be equal, depending on whatever available space there is. All right, if you want to make a 1 FR, 2 FR, and a 1 FR, the 2 on the side would be half of the one that's 2 FR. So you can divide it up that way. It's sort of like a percentage, but without having to calculate. You don't have to think about, well, what are 2/3? Well, you can just put 2 FR and then a 1 FR, and the one that's 2 FRs is 2/3. So it makes that a little easier to work with, but you can use pixels. You can use auto is really handy, where you don't know, but you want some space in there, and it might resize, and that's good. All right, so you can see how you can sort of combine all of these together. So if you look here, grid lines are automatically assigned positive numbers from these assignments. -1 would be an alternate for the very last row. So this is sort of dividing it up where you have 40 pixels, 50, auto, 50, 40. And then you look at the numbers here, number 1. Now the top bracket is the horizontal line. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4. -4, interestingly enough, is so you can do them negatively, right? So -4 is the same as 1. This is very similar. If you've taken my programming class, you have Python. Indexing, negative indexing works backwards. The only thing is we don't start with 0. Keep that in mind. All right. So you create these grid lines, and you can do the grid template columns. You can do the rows like this, doing it the same way. These little dots just mean what you could put in there. So you could put like 1FR, 1FR, rows, blah, blah, blah. So you can make it so some of these are in percentages or fixed pixels or whatever. And so keep that in mind. And so this is what you might see. You can choose to name the lines. So you might want to say grid template columns. You have first, you have 40 pixel, line 2, 50 pixels, line 3. So you're saying between the first line and line 2, there are 40 pixels in between. And between line 2 and line 3, you have 50 pixels. So that's a nice way of doing it. And then you got your auto, which is right here. So these are the CSS here are representing what's down here. And remember, these are the columns, 40, 50, auto, and then it'll be 50, 40. So and then you have this call for start. And then you have just 5. You can name it. This is just trying to show you can name it whatever you want, and then end. Okay. And if you look down at the bottom, first, line 2, line 3, call for start, 5, end. They're just trying to illustrate that you can name it whatever you want. Treat it like a name of a class. You would never start with an integer. You always want to start with a letter. And then don't ever have spaces, so you'd want to put dashes. But you can have numbers after, but no special symbols. Just best to keep it simple. All right, so you can give lines more than a name. Anyway, so you got all these ideas. Let's just jump down. If multiple lines share the same name, they can be referenced by their line name and count. So if you have call start, you put the number 2, that gives it 2 call starts. And then you're naming them. The first one is call start, the second one is call start. And then here's the FR. I told you this would be a 3-column layout, even each of them 33.3% wide. Right? So again, it's a fraction of the free space of the grid container. So this is a relative sizing. And here you can do fractional units and specific ones. So what's going to happen is it'll say the free space is calculated after non-flexible items. So the first thing it does is it reserves 50 pixels in your width. It figures out, all right, let's say you have 500 pixels. Well, 50 pixels are reserved. So the remaining FRs are 450 divided by 3. Because you take away the 50 pixels, then everything else is relative. So remember, you got to figure out what that is first. And you can do them all fixed pixel sizes, but the problem with that is screens change size, right? All right, now this is I'm going to end here on this particular one because I think this is an important one. I use this a lot, and that's grid template areas. So what you can do is you can name the areas using the grid area property, and you can repeat the name of a grid area will cause the content to span the cells. This I found works the easiest for me, and I want to just show you what happens here. So you have this dot item A grid area header, dot item B grid area main. So we're naming it header, main, sidebar, footer. This is great when you have an overall layout of what your website looks like. You got your header, your main, your sidebar, and your footer. And then on your container, what you do is you display it as grid. You can set your columns. So here they're setting all the columns at 50 pixels. And then your rows are going to be automatically spaced. But now check this out. You create this template area. And you'll notice all of these say header. That means the header will be from left to right across the entire width. And then you see main and main, that covers 2. Where you see a dot, I'm pretty sure that just is empty space. And then sidebar on the side, and the footer does the same thing as the main. Let's take a look and see if I'm right. Yep, the dot is empty. There you go. So that's the big thing I want you to know about grids, because this will help you set them up. And honestly, I would do it this way most any time. It's my favorite way of doing a grid. So that's all of my explanation is going to be based off of that. Now, once you have this in mind and you know how the sizing works and the rows and the columns, you could replicate just about any kind of grid design you like. So in my next video tutorial, I'm going to be generating some grid layouts on my page. So stay tuned for those. And if you got any questions, let me know. Do learn these terms. You might be quizzed on them. So pay attention to that.